any means necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jacquie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And it's Friday, which means it's time for another edition of our weekly segment, the Redspin Report, where we discuss sports, politics, and struggle with Nate Wallace, co-host of the Redspin Sports Podcast. Nate, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, glad to be back.
Absolutely. And Nate, for today's Redspin Rewind, where we take a look at sports documentaries, movies, and other media, we're going to discuss the 1994 movie Blue Chips, which starred Nick Nolte, had Alfre Woodard in there. We got a brief scene with the great Lou Gossett Jr., a real-life NBA star Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway, Larry Bird makes a cameo in there. We have Dick Vitale and, some real-life legendary college basketball coaches, Bobby Knight, Rick Pitino, Bob Cousy, Jerry Tarkanian, and others. And this is a movie about a struggling college basketball program that tries to be clean, tries to stay away from the dirty money and the corruption that oftentimes comes along with college basketball, but basically gives in for the sake of victory. And, I feel like it touches on a number of very relevant things in the world of college sports here, Nate. And so just wondering some of your top line thoughts about this classic movie.
Yeah, I think in summation, I'll kind of start with my summation and then kind of work backwards. It's basically to me a metaphor for the dilemma of the liberal idealist in this country. This idea that, academia is this institution that's unblemished. It's above it all. It's above the fray. It's above the capitalist marketplace, right? It transcends all that, just sort of like these people that you think of old English literature professors that are, just ridiculous idealists that are, anti-materialist. And basically in this analysis, it's presenting the problems not as exploitation, not of poverty, not of you look at Penny Hardaway's character, Butch McRae, and the kind of conditions they're living in Chicago, the issue of small time farmers being run over by, big corporate farms in Indiana, with that character and the town that Larry Bird is there and everything. And you have that all these dynamics in play, really, point to not capitalism not being the problem. It's simply just corruption. And it also, this whole film starts off with the coach just tearing into the team in a way, y'all suck, blah, blah, blah. It's look, coaches are can jump on teams, but all the time. But that was, to me, pretty not realistic. That's not the way you do it in terms of during a game, you're trying to get your guys to play at a certain level. You dress them down, but usually build them back up. And but nonetheless, the whole movie is just couched in these endless examples of kind of moralizing and creating this juxtaposition between the down with the program boosters and this principal coach who's just a great soul, sort of the way they're trying to project this guy who's just, having to compromise his morals in order to survive. What a shame it is. Instead of it being what a shame it is that, Penny Hardaway's mom, needs that job so badly, needs that house so badly that he literally has no choice but to stay and play without any sort of agency of his own. And therefore, in the coach, the same guy that's being hailed as this one who's having this great moral crisis about, oh my gosh, we're sending the wrong message. It's all about money. It's all about money, and it's because of guys, to me, hardly the biggest scandals or worst parts of the film are the fact that the players made some money. The guy got $30,000 for a tractor, right? The Penny Hardaway's character's mom gets a home and gets a job. And then even the point saving scandal. They win the game. It's but yet we're not meant to think of the tragedy of poverty, the tragedy of lack of opportunity. The way they portray these guys as if that he's got the player at the beginning who ends up being the point shaving guy. He literally is portrayed as failing TV class, right? They just it's this institution that has virtue that is being tainted by sport and by the people that are undeserving that brings along. And it's basically framing the villains as the people that are the victims of capitalism, essentially, instead of the people that are the predators in this thing, as being what they are. And like, this is, again, post-Cold War, post-Soviet Union, triumphant, end of history, Francis Fukuyama type stuff. And like, so it's just total like triumph of neoliberalism type era. And it's with that comes all this romanticizing of the marketplace and playing by the rules, right? It's all about fair play, right? If we just get all the corruption out and just get fair play back installed and get back to our good morals and values. Of course, abstraction, right? They can't materially be defined. Then somehow these bad forces will go away and we'll cease setting a bad example for our children. It's just ridiculous.
It's funny. I think of that movie, and aside from, the overacting of Nick Nolte, which always amused me, how he's a consistent overactor. I mean, that movie just really has not aged well. And when we think about the way sport is being examined in a lot of documentaries that are coming out on streaming services now, and the kind of corruption and the very pervasive influence of exploitation and capitalism that's happening in all major sports leagues. And, we're looking at the player struggles, the struggles of the athletes in the NCAA. I mean, this movie in particular has not aged well at all, Nate. And I mean, I think it's a really good example of how Hollywood indoctrinates us into thinking positively about the system of exploitation in this country, even through sport. We kind of think about that all the time through, military movies and that kind of thing. But I think this was a great point that you brought up about how Hollywood just kind of whitewashes exploitation, even through the way it portrays sports.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the Office scene when you have all the coaches show up in Chicago to go visit, Penny Hardaway's character Butch McRae, played by Penny Hardaway, and you see the head coach walk out of the office, and you see that you got Jim Boeheim from Syracuse in there, Jerry Tarkanian, the Shark, UNLV running Rebels guy. You got some of the old time guys from the old Big East, schools like St. John's coach, and they're all in there. And the coach comes out and he's speaking. I know I'm always hesitant to use slave metaphors, but it really is like an auctioneer talking about come get your piece of our guys. Doesn't have a name like Wahad or Raheem, his name's Butch, and he's made just come get him. Come get him. He's going to win you games. He's going to give you this. And it's all about what he's going to provide for those coaches, what kind of value they're going to be able to extract. And I felt like that scene really just encapsulates everything we just mentioned previously about this film and just the exploitation that's being central to it. I mean, you look at the Shaquille O'Neal character too, like Neon, and the things he says, the way that they just automatically perceive him as being a certain type of way, about the SAT score thing, about the and then in the English class where he's asking about what about African literature and culture. They're using that whole cultural bias thing almost as a joke back then, though. It's like you talk about how much the culture's changed. It's like films would not attempt to kind of make that play anymore, at least. So that's one example of how things have changed. Using that, they literally are using that whole cultural bias thing, kind of oh yeah, dumb jocks, just opportunistically saying stuff like that to, get sympathy. It's just silly. Let's move on. And it's it's not the silliest point actually, so. Yeah, so much wrong with what goes on. Not to mention, I don't know if you noticed in the last thing is that Bobby Knight's Indiana Hoosiers team are the only licensed team with NCAA memorabilia paraphernalia.
Mm-hmm.
None of the other. So that's meant to create a juxtaposition between the corruption of Western U and the sleazy boosters, and allow Bobby Knight to be presented as the knight in shining armor who does things the right way, pun intended, with his Indiana Hoosiers team, are really the embodiment of traditional Middle American, old, apple pie values, essentially. And that's the contrast they're trying to create there, which is ridiculous if you know the history of Bobby Knight and how that's played out in the time since. So.
Yeah, and I really like that scene with Lou Gossett Jr. that you were talking about. I mean, I hate that we only got that one scene with him, but here you have this black principal clearly resentful of these, white coaches from these moneyed, rich institutions, sniffing around the mostly black boys. And so there was clearly resentment in the way that he kind of came out and said all of that. And then when he left in to talk with Nick Nolte in his office, who he seemed okay with, I mean, they were clearly very uncomfortable with it. And yet, there were, I agree with you that it sort of lets the system off the hook in a number of ways. And, just thinking about how Penny Hardaway's character, the fact that he was from Chicago, Alfre Woodard was his mother. And I thought it was interesting because just last week we were talking about Hoop Dreams, which was shot in Chicago. And even the apartment that Penny and Alfre Woodard and their family was in sort of reminded me of where Arthur Agee and his family used to live. But what was funny was how they made it seem like, oh, well, his mother, she's a piece of work. And, she charges schools to speak to her son. And, I can get her to waive that and blah, blah, blah. And, making it seem, they almost made it seem like Alfre Woodard, this poor working class black mother, was strong arming this this basketball program and to, basically leverage her son for a better lifestyle instead of the other way around. You know what I mean? And so it's just a lot of little sort of juxtapositions and sort of ways you can put things side by side and the way that it lines up with reality. And yeah, and I'm glad that you sort of got into the whole piece with Indiana, because I did notice that and I figured that there had to be some kind of meaning behind it, but didn't quite know what it could be. But I definitely think you're onto something in the way that you sort of broke that down, Nate. And shifting gears a little bit from a basketball movie to a real life hockey, a very serious situation with the Chicago Blackhawks team and in a sexual assault scandal to where Kyle Beach has revealed himself as a John Doe, a previously anonymous person who filed a lawsuit against the team in May because he had made complaints to team leadership back in 2010 that Brad Ulrich, the video coach at the time, had sexually assaulted him, and how his complaints basically went ignored until after the team won the Stanley Cup that season. So here was a person who had his position on the team threatened by someone in authority, and it was swept under the rug until they could win the big one. And so I mean, it's pretty gross how this played out, Nate. I was watching an interview that Kyle Beach did. He was very emotional in terms of how things have played out. And so, I mean, what do you make of this? It's hard to even really know what to ask in the sense that it feels just so indicative of how abuse is treated on a number of levels in the world of sport. But I mean, what's your take on this whole Kyle Beach situation?
Well, the first thing I noticed is like when Beach is speaking to Rick Westhead on TSN, which is the Canadian, sports channel, about like what happened. It's interesting that like his first impulse, and it's just something you see a lot where like victims like internalize like, sense of shame and blame, that like he's the one that feels like he needs to apologize, right? And that like he wishes he could have done more, blah, blah, blah. And he's the one that like did report this, did go through this himself. And yet I think that's just a common thing of how victims end up like the experience they have and what this does to people psychologically, emotionally. But I think that ultimately when you see like all these people, like the coach and the GM, finally Bowman being out now, the coach had been down with the Florida Panthers and had, been a highly successful guy, Joel Tenneville, and, basically finally now lost his job, but only after an outcry over like 2 nights ago, him actually being behind the bench coaching after all this came out. It just shows a total disconnect between like, the NHL, like the rank and file of players and the establishment of this league and the way they view things and like the reality of those things. Like, and the fact that this is not just some like, issue of competitive advantage, that's the way they viewed this. They didn't want it coming out during the playoffs, because it would have been a distraction. Now, what happened because of that? This guy, Brad Aldrich, was able to go on, take a job coaching teenagers in Michigan, coaching hockey, and then another kid ends up getting sexually assaulted purely because they didn't want to inconvenience the Blackhawks Stanley Cup run, having a videographer, having it come out that what he did to Kyle Beach. Therefore, it's just another example of how, in this society, it's like always about promoting the virtue of the individual and pointing out how under socialism, it's like, the individual's repressed, the individual's restricted, freedom is denied, all this stuff. But what happens to individuals in the structure of a corporate, capitalist structure, when you're in the structure of a corporation within capitalism, your individual well-being is absolutely, secondary if it matters at all, through like the institutional reputation of that organization that you are earning a wage from, earning a living from. And therefore, like all that you see the hollowness of all the individualism and like the way that like people like romanticize the idea of the individual being at the forefront in capitalism, when we so clearly see time and time again, the institutional reaction is always to cover up and always to protect the profit-making corporate institution above all else, right? So it's a different type of collectivism. It's just a collectivism for the corporate entity itself, and not for the people at large.
Yeah, and even though an independent investigation corroborated Beach's allegations, where he named other members of the team in his reporting of the assault, I mean, not only did Aldrich continue to assault others, but he really, other than being fired, he really continued to get benefits from the Stanley Cup win. I mean, so what were some of the things that Aldrich ended up being rewarded with, even though the independent investigation found that he did, in fact, sexually assault this player?
Well, I mean, he literally got to just prance around. I mean, the Stanley Cup is the most famous trophy in sports, essentially. I mean, it's been around forever. It's the same cup every year. You get every member of the team gets their name inscribed on the cup. His, I think, was inscribed on it too. I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. He got to pose with the cup. He got to go around, going on this tour they go on. The team goes on with the cup after they win. And getting to be celebrated as a hero, despite them knowing behind the scenes, like that this guy had done what he did. But yet, let's just keep a wrap on it because this is just so inconvenient. It's so not something we want to have to deal with. Therefore, let's let him go on, and then we'll also let him go be hired by another school to work with young kids and have a chance to have access to them. And surprise, surprise, what happens? We have more victims, right? And it's just, and there's, what's the accountability? Even like losing their job at this point is compared to the harm that's been inflicted on other people's lives as a result of, people doing the convenient thing instead of the right thing. It is indicative. It's endemic in, decision making within corporate structure of U.S. society. And that's endemic to the capitalist economics.
Yeah, and that is just really, for me, just probably the worst aspect of this. I mean, what happened to Kyle Beach was criminal, but the only thing worse than that was the fact that had it been handled properly, then this could have literally saved a child from being attacked. And I mean, it just feels like such a glaring example of how important glory and money and recognition and all these things, in the world of sport and the deep exploitation that happens there, and just how it can really have a kind of impact on people that I think oftentimes rarely gets seen. And I mean, I can't imagine what it took for Kyle Beach to go public. I mean, we know that overall, because of patriarchy and things like that, there's a real stigma around male victims of sexual assault. And then when you sort of wrap that up within the world of machismo of organized sports, and, to be on a winning team and then to be a championship one, it's just so many layers that can add to a person's victimhood. And I mean, as such, I think a serious look needs to be given to the fundamentally abusive nature of a lot of these sports and ask some serious questions of how it can be changed. But we're going to leave it there for now here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I want to thank Nate so much, as always, for joining us today. We'll be right back, so please stay with us.
By any means necessary.